Hello and good evening, all. Welcome to the 2025 edition of International Week. The University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland. The university respects the sovereignties, histories, cultures, and languages of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and all First Peoples who continue to enrich our vibrant community. The territorial acknowledgement is an important start to all University of Alberta events, and it gives us pause to think about our relations with Indigenous people and with the land, and how we are continuing to work to improve those relationships. And that is especially true as a way of starting International Week, which its tagline is "For a Better World." And I am delighted that you have found your way to International Week this year. We are in our 39th year of hosting International Week at the University of Alberta, and it has been a wonderful way for members of our community to come together and share their experiences, share their ideas on global challenges and the solutions they've found or are hoping to find to improve the world in which we live. So if this is your 39th year of visiting International Week, welcome back. I think for many, it is an opportunity to reconnect with community. If this is your first time to International Week, I hope that you will find a reason to join us again next year, and that you'll be inspired to take away some great ideas from the week. I am delighted that Meredith Preston McGee from the Global Center for Pluralism is here as the keynote for International Week and to kick off this week. The team at University of Alberta International who planned the week wanted to focus the week on solutions and solutions for positive change, rather than focusing the week on an exploration of the problems that we face. It was to be a focus on the solutions that are bringing people together to find solutions to the world's challenges. And that is really part and parcel of what the University of Alberta is all about, is finding solutions to global challenges. We challenge ourselves to create opportunities for our staff, our students, to find themselves as global citizens. And it's really exciting this week that the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation launches their Top 30 Under 30, which is recognizing Alberta youth who are making a difference in the world. And this year's Top 30, 10 of those top 30 are University of Alberta students or alumni. So we really do, yeah. So we really do have an impact, and our students really challenge us to continue that good work. Just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes an entire university community to raise International Week. And so I'm really delighted that tonight we have both the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, and Marvin, thank you for being with us and for helping us with tonight's event, and the Office of the Vice Provost, Access, Community, and Belonging, who together joined us in thinking about how to launch International Week and what some of the challenging questions we're facing in the world. And it's delightful, Meredith, that you're here to kick this week off. So, Carrie, I think I'd like to invite you for introductions, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Doug. And thank you, everyone, for coming out on this beautifully cold Alberta and Edmonton evening. My name is Carrie Smith, and I'm currently serving as Vice Provost Access, Community and Belonging here at the University of Alberta. And I'm so pleased to be in partnership with my colleagues here today to bring you this evening's event, the kickoff keynote for International Week. And it is very fitting that we're talking about collaborations, because my first experience with our keynote speaker today was in August of 2024, so just a little over 6 months ago. And as a university at that time, like so many universities across the country and across North America and truly around the world, we just spent the better part of a couple of months really being in dialogue with one another, thinking about what it means to experience firsthand the difficulty of meeting one another where harm and grief collide, in learning how to share even in our differences, and in asking ourselves, what are universities for in this moment? How do we hold universities as sites for transformation and learning, and as productive spaces of tension where we can move through conflict together? And these are some of the conversations that I got to have with Meredith, and so I'm so pleased that that collaboration has continued today. This event is also kicking off, or leading into, I guess I should say, the kickoff of Changing the Story, which is the integrated action plan that built from those many conversations that I had with many of you. And one of the key practices at the heart of that plan is supporting uncomfortable encounters. And I'd like to read just a tiny bit from how we describe the practice of embracing an uncomfortable encounter. Encounters tend to be understood as new or unexpected meetings within or across species, ideas, or with the world around us. Every one of us carries a history of encounters that contribute to who we are. Encounters contain within them the possibility to catalyze something new, such as a new perspective or approach. When not held with care, they can also make us less willing to engage with new ideas or perspectives. When thinking about encounters, the question isn't how do we reduce or eliminate uncomfortable, unfamiliar, or disruptive moments. Rather, the question is, how might we better support people through such encounters in ways that might enable more transformational learning and relationships? And I think it is exactly these questions that are at the heart of our conversation and the heart of the talk today. So part of tonight is to build just such capacities, and we're really pleased to have you here in joining us in that venture. And now, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. Meredith Preston McGee is the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. Previously, Meredith mediated and advised on a range of mediation processes as the Regional Director for Africa with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and before that with the UN. She served as an advisor to Kofi Annan during the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation. Through more than 20 years in Africa, she helped to establish and facilitate peace processes in Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan, and elsewhere. She contributes to policy discussions on peacemaking globally, including teaching on inclusion and peace process and design. Thank you, Meredith, for joining us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. You all came out in the cold and in the cold, and I'm really grateful for it. I really look forward to this evening's discussion. Just to start with, again, a huge thank you to Marvin, to Carrie, to Doug, to the University of Alberta for inviting me to speak tonight and for leaning in just so enthusiastically to these discussions of partnership with the Global Center for Pluralism. I do feel from the first conversation that Carrie and I had that it was a meeting of minds on a lot of these issues, and we're really looking forward to continuing continuing that collaboration. So I was asked to speak to you on the power of uncomfortable conversations. And I have to confess that the last 48 hours have sort of put that in a slightly different light. For me, I'm sort of imagining the uncomfortable conversations that happen at Mar-a-Lago. But that's not actually what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. But I did want to start just with a précis. I wrote this speech a couple weeks ago about what's happening around us and with our southern neighbor in this moment, because I think it brings into focus the fact that there's an opportunity in this moment for Canadians to talk to Canadians. And that's, in fact, a lot of the theme of my speech. And so it was really interesting to see the events of the last couple of days really bringing into relief the importance of us talking to one another across the diversity of Canada. So I wanted to talk about really the power of talking for change and how we can lean into understanding in these really divided times. So why is it so hard to talk to each other? It feels like it should be the most natural thing in the world. We talk to one another all the time. But to talk to one another and to really understand and get under the skin of what somebody else is trying to convey to you, what they mean, what their intention is difficult. It's always been hard, but I think it is more difficult in our challenging times today. Global threats are on the rise. We're constantly bombarded with ideas of anxiety and threat. It's the climate crisis, it's the economic crisis, it's conflict around the world, it's financial crisis and housing crisis here at home, it's what's happening to us now with our southern neighbor. It's all of these things are telling us to be afraid. Social media, the rage algorithm online. And when we feel under threat, we perceive that we are in a space of scarcity. And when we find that scarcity and uncertainty, we have an instinct to really protect our own beliefs and identities and to sort of contract from one another. We seek out those who share our views on the problem and on how it's to be resolved, and we sit in a sort of a space of ideological safety where we're not really challenged. And while this may feel like we're reinforcing our own rightness and our own comfort, what we actually need to do is reach out, to not accept the premise of polarization, to invite disagreement in and greet it with understanding. But I know that's not simple. I know we're all feeling a lot of anxiety. Every year, I find in January that I'm sort of ushering the last year out as fast as I possibly can. I'm sort of grateful that somehow with the turning of a calendar page, the next year is going to be better, and we're going to feel somehow like things are going to magically get better because randomly it's the 1st of January. This year, I found it even harder to muster that somehow fictitious sense of optimism that we always have at the very beginning of the year. And I was trying to locate really why I was feeling heavier this year than I'd felt in the past. And you know, we talk a lot these days about polarization and mistrust, but I realized that it was beyond that, that the thing that was weighing me down was that we don't just mistrust one another, but we misunderstand one another. And I think this gets masked by when we talk about polarization and division. It assumes a divide that's fixed. But we're different and we disagree, but we don't actually have to be divided. And when we accept the premise of polarization, we accept the premise that divisions are elemental and they can't be bridged, addressed, or lived with. And when we do this, we fear our differences and we fear our diversity, rather than recognizing that they are our strength, but it's all a matter of approach. And if we're going to change this cycle, there's obviously many things that we need to do, but I think really resisting misunderstanding and leaning into the power of these uncomfortable conversations that result is what we need to do. Now, we're fortunate at the Global Center for Pluralism because pluralism really helps us to frame how we engage on these issues. Pluralism really helps us center the kinds of choices that we want to make in a society, the choices to engage with our differences in ways that are constructive, to walk into rooms and recognize that despite differences, we can engage with one another with respect and dignity in a way that brings belonging as the core goal for any kind of engagement that we're having in society, even when the tensions are real and the differences are great. Because we do disagree, and that's okay. But it's this cycle of mistrust and misunderstanding that is really holding us back from figuring out ways of building constructively on our differences. And I find that the misunderstanding and mistrust really do fuel one another. Willfully or otherwise, somebody will say something to you and you'll think, well, that's not really what he meant. And I think, he uses that word, well, I know what I think he means when he uses that word. And we refuse to hear what somebody's trying to say. We assume that they're assuming something about us, and we won't hear what they intend and what they mean. And when we do this, we're weaponizing our own tools of communication at a time when we need to preserve our tools of communication more than ever. So why is it so hard to talk? The power of the uncomfortable conversation is that we actually have to go where we're going to be misunderstood and where we might misunderstand. That's actually part of the process, but we have to persist through that in order to construct something different. What I find with the uncomfortable conversations that I have had and that we try to foster at the Global Center, that there's three things that we need. We need to come into these conversations by talking and listening, not by defending a position. We need to recognize that understanding is actually a goal in the conversations, and that understanding does not require agreement, and that understanding doesn't mean endorsement. We need to see understanding for what it is. So I've done this all my life, but in places, as Carrie was mentioning in my bio, in places of conflict, of violent conflict. I'm originally from British Columbia. I'm from the place that doesn't know what to do when it snows, which is the reason I was delayed coming in earlier today. And none of my BC relatives can believe I'll survive in the minus 27 of Edmonton. But I actually spent most of my life outside of the country, away from the snow. And the focus of my work has really been on how societies, when they are in the deepest throes of violent conflict, can find ways to come back together and talk. So when you've been pitted against one another generationally, how do you find your way to talk to one another across those kinds of divides? How do you get to a place where you can pause the violence long enough so that you can talk about what a compromise might look like? And if you can get a small compromise going, maybe you can expand the table of talks. Maybe you can get people to stop fighting a little bit longer. And if you can get them to stop fighting a little bit longer, maybe you can get a real process going where you can talk about how you can actually live together in ways that everyone feels that their needs can be met without resorting to violence. And it's long and it's slow, but it is what we believe is the only way to genuinely resolve conflicts around the world. And if we're successful, the battle lines soften, communities can start to trade again, language, we hope, de-escalates and wounds heal, and children can go to school together, and we can start seeing how we can actually engage with one another. And it's slow and it's difficult, but it is necessary. And being away from Canada for a really long time, I sort of assumed that it was Nigeria and Somalia and Sudan that needed our help to talk to one another, and that Canada was fine. It's wonderful, being away from Canada for a long time, you have the most wonderfully idealized version of your own society. But when I came back, I realized that I probably had things a little bit the other way around. And I realized that maybe, although we love to believe that we can talk so easily across our differences, that maybe some of those skills had faded. Maybe we aren't as good at it as we think we are. But then I realized that I think a lot of us feel like it's in our DNA. And if you think it's in your DNA, maybe you think it's a muscle you don't need to exercise. But it isn't actually cellular. It is muscular. And I worry that it's something that's atrophied and we need to start exercising it again. So how do we start? I know this is a space for solutions, and so I did want to talk a little bit about how we do that. But first, another sort of caveat, maybe a bit of a challenge and difference to a lot of the work that I've done around the world. One of the advantages to doing this kind of work in situations of violent conflict is that you have a really clearly defined role. I could walk into a space between parties, speak to different parties to a conflict, and I'm there as a peacemaker. That's my identity. I can sit down with a senior rebel general in South Sudan, for example, and I am there to try to get him to a peace table. He will try to explain to me why he's a freedom fighter and not a warlord. He will tell me that the issues of his people, the plight of his people, his version of history, and it's not my job to necessarily agree with him, but it's also not my job to disagree with him. I may think that this is self-aggrandizing power narratives. I may not actually think that, and I may be unsure. But my job is to get him into a space where we can get to a process of peace, where his needs and interests can be addressed enough that we can start a process to de-escalate the violence. But in the messiness of our everyday lives in Canada, we don't have a peace process. We don't have the boundaries of something that will give us the architecture to try to figure out how to talk to one another. We don't have the existential threat of conflict, I don't think. And so the stakes aren't high enough for us here to really talk to one another. And so in a strange way, it's a more difficult exercise. I also do recognize that when we do perceive extreme division, and I think our social media tells us a lot that there's extreme division, I don't necessarily think that there is as much as we think there is. But when we believe there is, we feel that we have to defend what we believe at all costs. And so if you sit down with someone with whom you disagree, and you're going to sit there and really simply try to understand their side of an argument, does that mean you're giving in? Does it mean you're endorsing them? Or are you missing an opportunity to defend your position and make them see what you see? Maybe you'll feel that the divisions are too great and that right now in the midst of threats, it's simply not the time to talk. But we know that it is. Because when we do seek these spaces of understanding and we shift our objectives for the conversation towards that, it's really interesting what's possible. Because you might not agree, and maybe there's nothing that can be done for you to agree or for you to figure out what you can do on this specific issue. But you will learn something about the other person. You will learn something about why they think what they think if you engage in a conversation where you're trying to understand. And when you're talking, not to defend your own position, but trying to understand theirs and trying to share experiences, what might they walk away with where they've learned a little bit more about you, about something they might have assumed that they might change their mind. And both of you might walk away recognizing that there's kernels of truth in what you heard that you didn't agree with, but it might be something that you can build on. And so what does that do to how you might address the issue in the future? It's a less direct process and it feels uncomfortable, but I really think it's where we need to get to collectively resolve our issues as a diverse society. So I wanted to share with you a couple of stories. We are very fortunate at the Global Center for Pluralism that we confer every 2 years something called the Global Pluralism Award. And we give this to individuals and institutions around the world through a range of fields of practice who are really living pluralism in action. And some of them are the best examples of individuals and organizations that engage in really uncomfortable conversations and teach us how to do it in really difficult circumstances. And one of these laureates is a documentary filmmaker named Dia Khan. Dia is Norwegian. She's of Punjabi and Pashtun descent. She's a social justice activist, and spent many years on protest lines, advocating for issues, and then she realized that she wasn't seeing the kind of change that she wanted, and that her activism had to be through engaging with people that held radical, violent, extremist views, trying to understand those, and trying to help society engage differently with radicalization. And so Dia interviews white supremacists, senior members of the KKK, violent jihadists, murderers, and she sits with them and tries to understand why they think what they think and why they do what they do. And she asks questions and she probes, and she doesn't give up her own ethics or beliefs. She doesn't endorse and she doesn't agree, but she doesn't shut down. And she draws them out, and she asks more questions, and she probes further. And what she's found in this practice is that at the heart of all of the people that she's interviewed who hold deeply radical, violent views, that the core issue is one of belonging and a sense of a loss of belonging, the humiliation that's come with a feeling of a loss of belonging, a loss of dignity, and a loss of respect. And that reminds us that these are very human issues. And maybe when we think about de-radicalization programs by the government, that maybe humanity should be at the core of those rather than hard, securitized approaches. And she helps us see that differently. But what Dia's practice really teaches me, and I'm conscious that a lot of us would not engage in a conversation like that, but it reminds me of the power of questions. Because questions can disarm and de-escalate, and questions can really flip the script. And it's extraordinary what you can achieve when you start asking questions. So another example I wanted to share with you. We all know the online space at the moment feels vitriolic. The term rage algorithm is one that I hear over and over again. And we see that the polls are much better represented than the exhausted majority in the online spaces. And so one of our wonderful award laureates is a digital peace-building organization called Build Up. And they were looking at this issue and they thought, okay, so what can we do to try to de-escalate the culture online? Would it make a difference if there was just a lot more differences of opinion expressed in these spaces? If we could inject more differences of opinion, more perspectives, more ideas, would that start to de-escalate? If we add more perspectives, do we get to a pluralist outcome online? And they tried it, and it didn't work. So then they got a group of young techies, much more tech-savvy than I, certainly, and they went into a series of chats that were particularly vitriolic, and they tested different approaches to see what might de-escalate. And they tried fact-checking, and they tried different perspectives, and they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and they tried. And there was only one thing that worked. And the only thing that would work to de-escalate the vitriol was when you went into the chat and you said, "Tell me more." And you would get an answer that was not all caps, and it was not shouting at you. Now, it wasn't necessarily evidence-based, and you wouldn't necessarily have agreed with everything that was said, but all of a sudden it wasn't shouting. And their founder, Helena, said to me one time that, when somebody's listening, then maybe you don't have to shout. I think it's a reminder to all of us that we can, from time to time, just say, "Tell me more." So then there's the question of what is the space? What is the space that we're trying to create? And we talk a lot about creating spaces for the middle ground. And when we talk about that, we're not talking about pushing everybody's positions into some sort of mushy middle space. But we're talking about creating spaces, convening discussions where we're all leaning in to understanding with dignity and respect how we have these conversations. That we're leaning into the fact that all of us have a responsibility to help to solve problems and to help to do that with other individuals and groups that don't share our views. And that's part of being part of a diverse society. So how do we create some of those middle ground spaces? Well, I hear a lot from people that these spaces just don't exist. I hear others won't want to engage. I hear that we can't talk in the midst of hate and violence. But I also get asked how we rewire ourselves for these discussions and how we have the conversations when language is so weaponized. So when people ask me, I want to engage, but the space doesn't exist. Too many spaces are ones where I'm attacked. I try to have a conversation and people won't simply allow me to have that. Everyone comes with their positions. That's the only space that exists. And those spaces do exist, and it is complicated, but you can create these spaces. And that's really what we spend a lot of our time doing at the Global Center. And one of the things that I find when you do engage in a space where people are finding that space for understanding is that there's some vulnerability. You're asking people to come in and be perhaps more honest than they would be when they're carrying the wall of their own positions only and they're leaning into the discussion. It's valuable if these spaces are often private or small. And I imagine them often as concentric circles. They can start around a dinner table, they can start having coffee with a single individual, and then recognizing that there are others who want to have these different kinds of conversations, and we can build them out, and build them out, and build them out. But they do exist. And what if others don't want to engage? And surely there are people who we shouldn't engage. I get asked that all the time. And I recognize that we can't bring in everyone. But from a peacemaking practice, again, you can always find people who want to talk, even in the most extreme circumstances. And I've worked in northeast Nigeria on the conflict with Boko Haram. I've worked in Somalia on the conflict with al-Shabaab. Worked on Afghanistan before the Taliban were in power and now. And there's always somebody that you can talk to. But it's a matter of figuring out who, and maybe not starting with the hardest spaces first. But these divisions don't have to hold us back. We can have different kinds of discussions. But to do that, we also have to rewire ourselves a little bit. And it's an interesting practice because I think in a moment of uncertainty, like we are living through, certainty is ideologically safe. It feels good to believe something and to know that that's true, and that that's simply true and right, and that that's the way it is. But it gets us in a bit of a trap sometimes of an idea of binary thinking, that things are right and wrong, things are good and evil, there's your side and my side, and that's simply the way that it is. And if we're going to sit with the real complexity of any problem, and we all know that every problem is multifaceted and complex, that we have to actually gather a range of different perspectives. And to do this well, we do need to feel safe. We need to be able to stretch our ideological muscles and brain space a little bit. So we need a bit of safety, but we need discomfort as well. And safety isn't just about singular ideological certainty with other people that are going to reinforce the things that you think. We have to find these smaller spaces where people will maybe reject the core ideas of what you believe. And the response to that in the moment might have to be, tell me more. I need to understand why you think what you think. I also get told often that we can't talk in the midst of hate and violence. And I did want to say that I think this is really a trap that we get into in this moment. I recognize that there are a lot of emotions around so much of what's going on in the world. But even in the most violent conflicts, and I would say that I'm probably in touch with people who are in every single extreme conflict around the world, and there is talking everywhere, and there has to be. And if we don't find a way to have sort of the undergirding, that fabric of that kind of dialogue, what happens is the fragmentation almost starts to atomize, and there's nothing for us to come back to when it is space for us to have bigger kinds of dialogues. So I did want to end and wrap up because I really want to get to the conversation with Carrie, but I wanted to end on a bit of a hopeful note because I teach a lot on peace process design and on peacemaking around the world. And one of the themes that I talk about almost everywhere I go is the power of belief. And I know, Doug, you were talking about hope in action, I think is one of the themes this week, which I really love because those two things go together, right? You don't have hope without action, as Jane Goodall reminds us. But in every peace process I've ever been involved in, belief is absolutely at the core of what has gotten us through. When I worked for Kofi Annan during the post-election violence process in Kenya, it was absolutely extraordinary to see the mountains that could be moved around the world because people believed in Kenya. People believed Kenya was worth saving. People believed Kenyans could save themselves. People believed in Annan. and people believed in the process. It was singular in my experience. I've never seen that level of belief anywhere before. But I've also seen it with individuals. Most of the extraordinary mediators and peacemakers that I've worked with are like a dog with a bone that they won't let it go. And that bone is belief. They're like, I know that there is a space for dialogue. I know that if I can get the Prime Minister in Mogadishu to sit down with the President in Somaliland, which nobody thinks you can do, I know that if I can get them around a table, we can start something. And those mediators will spend a year or two or a lifetime building the relationships and having the tiny conversation here and the tiny conversation there and finding the problem solvers, maybe waiting until one of the problem solvers is a prime minister and getting to that right moment and believing that that's when you can bring people together. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again. But the other piece of that belief that's been really powerful is that in all of those conversations, when you sit down at that table, it isn't then a zero-sum game about what he believes and how you carve out the cake. It doesn't become about either or. The message is, how do you craft an and? How do you build that together? And you don't often hear that then when they go back to their own constituencies because they're playing to the gallery. But at the end of the day, the real things that get done in those spaces, it's about the and it's about leaning into those conversations. So I'm going to stop there and would love to continue the discussion with Carrie, but thank you so much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll let you take a sip of water. Thank you so much, Meredith, for your remarks and the stories. And in the spirit of questions and tell me more, I'm really pleased to be in a bit of a dialogue with you before we open it up to the audience, who I'm sure would also wish to follow up. But you spent time opening up that space for conversation, and I'd like to start with pluralism, which is at the heart. And you mentioned that pluralism gives us a frame for understanding the challenges of the moment. We are in challenging times, and those challenges are seeking to divide us. Can you expand on that? How does pluralism help us in this moment we find ourselves in?
It's a great question to start with. The first thing I would say is that I think we have to recognize the challenges. We can't be naive to those. And so one of the things that I think is really important about pluralism as a frame is that it is asking us to acknowledge and recognize our differences and our diversity, not to pretend that they don't exist, but to recognize that they are a strength that we have as a society, and that the actions that each of us take, not just government, not just big institutions, but each of us as individuals take, can build towards a culture of engaging constructively with our differences, with our diversity, in a way that centers belonging and dignity and respect. So for me, it's really almost a North Star of how you want to engage, particularly when you feel emotional, when you feel that your own beliefs are being pushed back, when you feel particular emotion about events that are ongoing or about something that's going on. And that's valid. That's normal, I think, for all of us. But I think what pluralism helps us to do is to put it in that wider frame of what kind of a society do we want? We want spaces where all of us feel like we belong. And I think it's a very core universal value. You now have it in your title, that we can all remember a time when we've really felt like we belonged, when we felt like it's our sort of our place. And we can all remember a time when we haven't. And I think we can all remember a time when we've been involved in making someone else really feel like they belong, really bringing them in. And I think we could all probably think back to a time when we've made somebody feel like they didn't. And that can be 6th grade playground, and it can be last week. But it's something that is genuinely universal. And so I think for me, there's something really anchoring about that as an ethic that if we can all get back to, all of our other differences are things that we can find ways of working through.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to get a little bit deeper into the belonging piece. But before I do, you speak here and just now on the spaces that we need to create to have these conversations and ensure a sense of belonging for all. But what happens when the topic feels impossible to discuss? And what does it look like to create a space of possibility in that impossible moment?
Yeah, and I think it feels like there's a lot of things we can't talk about these days, for sure. There's maybe two things that I would say about that. The first is that certainly in pretty much every peace process I've ever been involved in, you don't start with the hardest thing first, and you build relationship. And you build a sense of trust up to a place where you can talk about the hardest of the hardest of the hardest issues. You don't start with having no relationship with someone and then having the hardest possible conversation. This has to be a journey where you're building relationship into those kinds of spaces. But the second thing I would say, and there's been some colleagues that we've worked with over the last couple of years that have been particularly helpful to me on this, is that sometimes you need to look for others who have been really practicing this around the issue that you're particularly looking at. And if I can give an example, over the last year and a half now, obviously everything began long before, but since the 7th of October 2023, those issues have been much more alive around Israel and Gaza and Palestine. And it's a very, very difficult conversation for everyone to have. And so at the Global Center, we decided that we needed to figure out a way to help people have that conversation. But it wasn't that I was going to have that conversation. I'm certainly not an expert on the situation in the Middle East or on having the conversation between Israelis and Palestinians, for example. So we reached out and spoke to a number of people who we'd started to develop some relationships with, and convened a dialogue with a Jewish professor of political science at Carleton University, Mira Sukharov, and a Palestinian law professor from the University of the Pacific in California, Omar Dajani. And they are research partners working together on literally having that uncomfortable conversation every single day. And they do it in person, and they do it online, and they do it on WhatsApp. And they have phenomenal strategies that they've developed simply as the two of them to try to figure out how they can do this together. They're writing a book together. They're developing a podcast together. They travel in the region together. And so just being in their presence was really instructive for a lot of us to just see how it's practiced. And so sometimes it is also finding others and finding those examples.
Mm-hmm. Your example, that's a really moving example, because it also underscores the fact that when we talk about conversations and we talk about belonging, we are also people in those spaces. And so I'm thinking a lot about power and knowing that conversations that need to be started, not everyone brings the same tools into the space. Not everyone brings the same ability to feel safe in conversations. And not everyone has the ability to feel they belong, even as we strive to build that into our spaces. So what advice do you have when we want to think about starting those conversations skillfully and carefully, acknowledging matters of power and identity?
It's such an important question, and I think, back to what I was saying in the lecture a little bit earlier, is that often, because we're doing this sort of in our unstructured everyday society, you don't have a peace process set of architecture to fall back on, where you say, well, there's a mediator and there's people that can help me with leverage and ensuring that I'm not being taken advantage of, or ensuring that I'm safe in these spaces. We don't have those sorts of structures in our everyday lives. But I think that a lot of the events over the last couple of years certainly are reminding us, though, that there are experienced dialogue facilitators in a range of fields of practice in our lives. And so I do think that there are people that we can turn to who have some of these skills. They might be faith leaders in the community. They might be holding other positions in community life, in university positions, and so forth. So I think one thing is to look for where those skills already exist and draw those people in to help us to convene, to help us to figure out how to have those kinds of engagements. I do think, though, that these skills. I was joking with our friends that we were with last week that these skills are not things that you develop overnight. It's not a sort of an idea where you have a 2-hour workshop and then you have these dialogue skills. It's a bit like if you went to your doctor's office for a couple of hours and said, "Great, now I can take out my own appendix." Sure. We need to practice this over time. And so I do think that some of it is also figuring out how we start in some safer spaces, but also to be cognizant that we shouldn't try the hardest first. And that's where power comes into it, that you don't necessarily engage in massively asymmetric spaces off the bat. You find people who you feel you can develop that kind of relationship with, and you draw in other allies and navigators, as it were.
Mm. I think the issue of asymmetry is a really interesting one, and maybe I'll shift to ask maybe one or two questions specific to the university environment before we open it up today, because one of the spaces that is a natural space, and you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking quite a bit about the role that pedagogy plays in these conversations and in facilitating and convening dialogues. And universities are places where pedagogy thrives. And of course, that is most seen in the classroom and where we have students teaching one another, and we have instructors engaging with students. And so I guess my question is, in the university environment, how might we think about the challenge of difficult conversations that instructors might face while also providing psychologically and culturally safe learning environments? How do we engage those natural spaces of difficult conversations in the manner that you're thinking about?
I think one thing to remember is that a lot of professors won't have the skills. And that's valid, right? Like, it wasn't necessarily, I don't know if there might be professors in this room, but that's not necessarily on your CV, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's a particular skill set. I know some universities across the country who've engaged dialogue facilitators that I know when they know that these conversations are going to be difficult in their classrooms, and they ask them to come in as a visiting lecturer, as a sort of a guest, invited guest into some of those discussions to help hold some of that space. I myself have been asked to do that in some university settings. I teach a course at ETH University in Zurich, and there were some particular dynamics with the course, with the lecturer and the students in that, and I come in as a guest lecturer every cycle for the master's course. And they'd asked me to hold an evening session because there was a lot of emotion. It was around the issues in the Middle East. And they needed someone to come in and just hold that space who didn't sit in the positions of power that exist within the university dynamic. I came in obviously as an outsider, but to enable that space to be held so that people could speak really freely. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can be, I agree with you, there's spaces that exist in the university, but also they shouldn't be a prison, right? We can be creative about how we use them and how we ask for help.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Maybe one final question regarding universities and the space for dialogue and uncomfortable conversations or encounters on university campuses. You know, not only do we share a commitment to education, research, and innovation, academic freedom is one of the defining features of universities, and which is part of freedom of expression, but of course is anchored in our collective agreements and in our founding principles. And so my my wonder is if pluralism is one way for us to better understand how academic freedom can and should play out as one way of engaging in dialogue across campuses.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, one I hope we're going to take up a little bit more this week in some of our conversations here. What I think pluralism offers us is not to set a series of boundaries. I feel like there's a lot of requests for boundary in the moment. And what I like about pluralism is that it isn't about the boundaries, it's about the foundation. And that if you have a foundation where everyone is walking into that space with a commitment around dignity, respect, and belonging, even with difference of opinion, even with different academic study and fields of practice in all of those spaces, there's a foundation on which you're resting that ensures that you're engaging in those in a way that you're attempting not to be harmful. And I'm conscious that harm can still be done, right? We all know that. But I think there's a way to have those kinds of conversations that roots us in a space of relationship with one another that connects to academic freedom. There's a Tlingit colleague of ours that we've worked with a lot on Indigenous issues of Indigenous reconciliation at the center, and she's always said to me that one of the issues around relationship as a foundational piece of pluralism is that if you focus on that undergirding of relationship, it enables you to come back when harm has been done. That when you've made the mistake, you're able to then come back from that. And I think that when you know that that exists, you can lean more into things like freedom, like those spaces where you don't quite know what's going to happen, but you know that when things do fall down, that you're able to find ways back together.
Thank you so much.